I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Just what do you think you're doing, Dave?
Why, you stuck-up, half-witted, scruffy-looking nerf herder.
This means something.
Charm! I am Locutus of Borg.
I must not fear, and fear is the mind killer.
Get away from her, you
Nerd! Nerd!
I'm Matt Kressel.
And I'm David Mercurio Rivera.
And
this is
Nerd Count. All right. So, this is the inaugural episode of the Nerd Count podcast. I'm Matt Kressel. I'm here with David Mercurio Rivera. Welcome, David.
Hey, Matt. So fun to be doing this with you. I mean, I think that we are honest to goodness nerds, and I think it's time to celebrate that fact.
It's a time to be proud of your nerdiness. I was a child in the 80s, and it was not a good time to be a nerd. Nerds were made fun of.
I know. I kind of resent the fact that my nerddom has been stolen from me. I mean, it used to be such a unique thing to be a nerd. Now it's, everybody's a nerd. But it allows us to do a podcast.
That is true. We can lean into it now instead of hiding our nerdiness.
Yes, instead of hiding in shame, we can display it to the world.
That's right. So I thought a good way to start the podcast was to introduce ourselves. By the way, today's topic, we're going to be talking about writers groups, the good, the bad, the ugly. So we're going to get to that in a minute, but I thought that we could start with just some introductions of how we got into writing. So, Dave, do you want to take the lead on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It all came down to having a year off from work back in ages ago when I decided to take a writing course, the Gotham Writers Workshop. I always wanted to write. I was an avid science fiction reader. And it was, something that I always said I wanted to do, but never did, and decided to just take a course. And through that course, I started to write short stories and learned about a lot of the craft of writing. And that ultimately led me to taking a science fiction course at the New School with Terry Bisson. And that helped me develop my craft for sure. Extremely helpful. And it led me to ultimately come in contact with our writers group, Altered Fluid. So that was tremendously helpful. But that's how I started writing. And since then, I have published, about approximately 50 stories in different magazines and anthologies, including Year's Best and World Fantasy Award nomination, Arthur C. Clarke Award nomination recently. It was always my dream to be in Analog and Asimov's FNSF, and it eventually happened. It took an awful long time, it seems, from my perspective, but I got there. How about you?
Well, I just want to ask you a question. So, you said earlier that you were always kind of nerdy, but do you have a specific influence? Like someone was like, "Oh, you need to read this comic book, or you need to read this book of fiction, this science fiction novel. You're gonna love it." Like, did someone introduce that to you?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that when I was, before I could read, I was going through my brother's comic book collection, his old Fantastic Four and Spider-Man's, which he sold, by the way. It's the age-old story of the lost valuable comic books. But reading through those, and that always inspired me to want to read comic books and go to comic book conventions back in the 80s. And I think that was my introduction to nerddom. And in terms of writing, when I was a little kid, I would write little comic books, which I have somewhere in my attic somewhere, but little comic books where I would write the dialogue. I had a friend who drew the pictures, and I had developed something called Power Pack about a bunch of kids that have powers. Sure enough, a few years later, Marvel published a comic book called Power Pack with kids with superpowers. Which,
they stole it.
It's the story of my life.
Yeah, you need to start a lawsuit. You're a lawyer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I am a lawyer, and you're right. It's time to litigate.
It's time to litigate.
Absolutely. How about you?
Yeah, so I first started writing seriously. Well, the first time I ever wrote anything with the intention of like maybe this could get published was in college. I had a particularly vivid dream that was so amazingly vivid and science fictional. I ran into the next room and told my roommate all about it. He's like, "Dude, you got to write that down." And I did, and I maybe wrote, I don't know, 30,000 words or something. And it was
Wow.
terrible, you know, it was like a very first draft thing, and I had it for a while, and then I always thought, "Oh, one day I'll finish that," and never really did. But I think it was around 2001, 2002. A friend of mine was taking a class at the new school and told me about a course they were teaching writing science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and ended up taking that. It was taught by Alice K. Turner, who was the famous fiction editor at Playboy. And I think you took that class too, David, but it was taught by Terry Bisson.
I took it a few times. I mean, I was looking for a writers group subconsciously without knowing it, because I kept taking the course over and over again. I took it twice with Terry
Yeah.
and once with Alice K. Turner.
Yeah, so I never had the pleasure of taking the class with Terry, but Alice was great. You know, I think had I like really looked into her bio, I probably would have been a lot more intimidated than I was, because boy, did she edit some heavy hitters. But the class was good.
Remember, she always had that little dog that she carried with her.
She had a little dog.
Like,
Yeah,
really cute. It always snapped at everybody.
yeah. There was a little snappy dog. I think she brought it to school a couple times, to class a couple times. But yeah, after that, she introduced me. Actually, it was her that introduced me to the Altered Fluid folks, because I think some of you had started a writers. Oh, you weren't in the group at that time. I think it was
No.
Chris Dykman, Paul Berger, a few other people, and yeah, Alice said, "Oh, I think here's two people I would recommend from the class that might be good." And it was me and Devin Poor, who's still in the group, and so yeah, that's where I hooked up with the Altered Fluid writers group. If those listening don't know who Altered Fluid is, we're a Manhattan-based writers group. David and I are still members. We've had some amazing past and current members: N.K. Jemisin, Elia Dawn Johnson, Sam Miller, E.C. Myers, bunch of other people.
Saladin
Ahmed. Yep. Yeah, so
Lee Thomas.
Lee Thomas, yes. Sometimes I forget because people have moved away. But yeah, they were all members. Some of them are still members. And we still meet.
What's funny is all the people that have come and gone in the group, what remains is really, that the group structure.
Yes.
And the methodology and all that. Everything, people come and go, but the group's structure and how it works has remained fairly constant.
Yeah, and it's a good segue, because that is today's topic is writers groups. And I think that it's kind of a polarizing subject. Sometimes you go to these panels at conventions and people will, there's people who are like so pro writers group, they love it, and there are other people like, writers groups are stupid, why would you ever do that, it's killing your voice, or they'll have some negative comment about it. And my experience with Altered Fluid specifically has been overwhelmingly positive, but I've also been in other writers groups that were just disasters, and I think maybe we're going to talk about some of those stories today. But so let's talk a little bit about like Altered Fluid. Like I was saying before, it started from some members who took Terry Bisson's class at the New School in Manhattan and continued meeting after the class, right? So
that's right. And both of, neither of us were original members. I think that it started maybe a year or two before we joined. And it was Alice or Terry, I forget which one it was, who referred me to Paul Berger. And I reached out, who was a member of Altered Fluid, and I reached out to him, and I came in and auditioned for the group. And they made the mistake of somehow I snuck in, and here I am 20 years later.
I remember when you came to the group, actually, we were meeting in Chris Dykman's office, and I was like, who is this quiet guy? He's just so quiet. Like, I don't know. It's just, you were just like, you were an enigma to me. It's very interesting that, you and I have become really good friends.
It is. I was actually overwhelmed. The first meeting, I was overwhelmed because I'd never encountered like so many like-minded people who had the same interests as I did. I was overstimulated.
Yeah.
I was overstimulated into silence.
Well, they say, it's finding your people, right? And it's true. It's like, you hang out with a bunch of nerds, and you can start talking the intricacies of like the Dune universe, or your favorite Deep Space Nine episodes, and you can't always do that in certain company, right?
No.
And
I've tried, and
it
comes up quite ugly, when you do
that. I mean, sometimes, with some of my relatives, we can talk maybe a little bit about The Mandalorian or Game of Thrones, but that's about the extent of it.
Yeah. And it's changed over time. It's people are more accepting of science fiction and fantasy. So
yeah. So we've been so like you said, you joined. I think I joined around 2003. Does that?
Yeah, and I joined. That's right. And I joined 2004. That's right.
You broke up a little bit. You said 2004.
Yeah, I joined in 2004. Is my recollection. I know it was post 9/11, certainly.
Yeah, and so what's interesting is so that's 20 years, right?
Wow. Yeah,
and
hard to believe.
And so the group is still meeting. We met last Tuesday. We went mostly virtual during the pandemic, and we're still virtual. But what do you think? What do you think is the reason why we're still here 20 years later?
I think it's because we're all so committed to our craft, and it's just the right chemistry, I think. Because yes, lots of members have come and gone, but I think that the foundational members, Chris Dykman, Paul Berger, you, Devin Pora, myself, I think those foundational members have a good chemistry, and that's what's kept it going. That's my theory.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of it is chemistry. And we can talk about that, in terms of like groups that have bad chemistry. And I think that's what's great about it. I also think that one of the strengths of our group is, it's almost never like ad hominem. Like, we don't be like, how dare you write something like this? And I think everyone,
or you're terrible at that.
Yeah, you're bad at that.
Yeah.
It's never like, well, I wouldn't have written this way, or I don't write space opera, or I don't write horror, so I don't have an opinion on this. But that's not what we do. Instead, we say, okay, I see what you're trying to do. Here's what I might do, or what I might suggest to make it better. So I think it's like the focus on constructive critiques. Is that your take on it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, that's the only purpose of the critique. If there's any other purpose, like to show how smart you are, or to satisfy your ego, to take the writer down a peg, those are all bad reasons. And luckily, none of that happens in our group. It's all about the story. How can the story be better? And given that lens, I think that's what the author is more receptive. And I'm always inspired after one of my stories is critiqued.
Yeah.
I never feel beaten down, like, oh man, I suck. It's more like, these are really exciting ideas, or this is, I'm glad this worked. I can't wait to make it better. always walk away inspired. That's a sign of a good critique. And giving an effective critique, I think that the recipe for that is explaining what's working and why, and what's not working and why. Not just, oh, I really love this. That's not useful. It's the and why part that is the heart of the critique. And then then receiving the critique that's an art in itself as well. You have to come in with an open mind, be receptive to criticisms, and I would say most importantly, keep quiet if you disagree. If you disagree with the critique, you don't argue with your critiquer.
Well, yeah, like you said, being open to suggestion, because we've heard that theory, the 10,000 hour theory, right? So the theory is like, in order to get mastery in anything, that you have to put in 10,000 hours of work. But I think it's more than just labor, right? So I think it's also, you have to have feedback, right? So if you're a basketball player and you're shooting hoops for 10,000 hours, but you don't have a coach, right? You're just doing it by yourself. You might get a little bit better, but you might hit a wall because maybe the coach is going to say, well, your shoulder needs to get a little lower here, and maybe you should, have your left foot a little forward when you're dribbling or something. I'm not a basketball person, obviously, but I feel like it's that kind of feedback, that constant small adjustment that really helps you improve. And I feel like with the writers group, I'm always getting that. So even if it's not my story, if it's someone else's story, if it's your story or Paul's story or someone else in the group, I'm learning, because I'm looking like, okay, why doesn't this work? Oh, it doesn't work because, they didn't develop the character enough, or I don't know what the character wants, or maybe the setting's a little gray. And then this helps me do the same thing in my own work. So then when I go back to write my own work, I'm like, oh, right, yeah, because I remember before when I read someone else's work and they tried to do this, it didn't quite work. Oh, maybe I'll adjust that here. So it's like, I think it's like that constant refinement that I like about writers groups.
No, I agree, and I think that we're all human beings, so we're with feelings. So it's natural to take it, to want to take it personally when somebody says that they didn't something is not working for them in the story. But again, it's important to come in with an open mind. And I agree with you, by the way, that all writers have a blind spot for their own work, and probably the best way you learn is by critiquing other people's work and listening to the critiques of other people's work. That's when you're more open-minded. But here's a point. I know that I've sat in on meetings where somebody says, yeah, I know what you liked. I don't even want to hear that. Just tell me what you didn't like. Let's just cut to it and tell me what's not working. That's not helpful either, because I think that it's important to lay out what's working so that when you go back and you revise the story, you don't edit out something that's really strong in the story, or maybe you can emphasize and make stronger. I mean, when somebody points out what's working, you can go back and really highlight that strength in the story. So it's important to hear the good and the bad, and also just again from a human perspective. Opening with what's working makes you, it's just human nature. It makes you more receptive to when the critiques come on things to improve.
Yeah, and along those lines, I don't think we described yet how exactly we do the critiques.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's important if someone listening is thinking of starting a writers group or maybe joining one. The
writer has to stand up back against the wall, and we get darts, right? And we
poison tips.
Poison tip darts, and we just shoot them, and
they have to be blindfolded.
Yes.
Yeah. So what we do is we share the stories by email, like about a week before the meeting. Usually it's like more like 4 or 5 days, but and then we all read it, usually 2 or 3 times, because oftentimes the first time through, you're like, oh, okay. And then the second time you can kind of see, what the author was setting up earlier in the story, where, maybe where their message isn't quite getting through. And then we try to come up with three things, like what you said, what works, what doesn't work, and what needs improvement. And then at the meeting, we used to have a timer. We don't really do it anymore, but we used to time the critiques to 3 minutes, because I think 3 minutes really helps the critiquer refine or like have concise thoughts, because otherwise they can ramble. I know I tend to ramble without a timer. But we've since gone off that, I guess, because our meetings have been a little bit smaller, so we don't need it as much. But when you have 10 people coming to the meeting, having a 3-minute timer is good.
Absolutely.
And then what we do is we go around in a circle while the writer is silent, and each person gives their critique, and the writer will write down the comments, and we go around, and then each person gets their turn, and then at the end, the writer says, "Okay, thank you everyone. Here's what I was trying to do," and then the writer themselves explains their story, what they were trying to accomplish, and maybe ask questions of people like, why didn't you think this thing worked, or what parts did you think that I could work on, because you mentioned this earlier. And then after they sort of give their, I don't want to call it a rebuttal necessarily, but their response, then we sort of what Chris Deichmann calls, we go into the free swim, where everyone sort of brainstorms ideas, and oftentimes I find that portion of the critique is the most helpful, because it's like everyone is like, okay, they know what you were trying to do, they've heard everyone's opinions, here's what I think could really, really work for you. And I found that part really helpful. One thing I want to say though is, I know that some writers groups recently, or I should say writers workshops, and I think Clarion does this. I'm not sure if Odyssey or Taos Toolbox or some of those others do it, but they had the authors reveal a author's statement before people read the story and say, here's what I'm intending, here's what I did, blah, blah, blah. And my thought on this, and I want to hear your thought, is I think I don't want to read that before I read the story. I think I want, because when you, like, here's the thing, when you're an editor, and this is like the dirty little not so secret in the industry, like editors, you're in the slush pile. They're probably not going to read the cover letter all the way through. They're just going to like look at it, maybe briefly scan it, but they're probably going to go right to the story. They're not going to read any intent. And the same thing is if the story is encountered in an anthology or online, almost certainly, I haven't seen it done where there's no author introduction to the story. There's no statement of author intent. It's just there. So most editors are going to approach a story by the story itself and not what the author says. Now, if I might read that author's intent at the end of the story, kind of like the way we do it in the writers group, where the author says, well, here's what I was trying to do. And that part I think totally works for me. But having a statement beforehand, I think kind of is, to me, antagonistic to the way, or maybe antagonistic isn't the right word. It just goes against what.
I agree with you. It's inconsistent with the way stories are read, right? The author is not sitting next to you when you read the story, whether you're a reader or whether you're an editor, explaining things, saying this is what I meant to do.
Yeah.
Now go ahead and read it. I think it's sort of a cheat to be able to provide a statement saying, this is a story. This story is going to creep you out, and it's supposed to have a surprise ending that is going to knock you off your seat. So keep that in mind as you're reading. That's I don't quite get that. It could be, maybe as a tool for teaching in some way at Clarion. Maybe that's what's driving it. I don't know, but I think that, our method in the writers group seems to work pretty well, where the author says, this is what I intended. And then during our free swim discussion, we can say, oh, well, if that's what you intended, then I would do this or that or the other thing.
I'm not saying, I don't think we're saying that our methodology is like the only way or the best way. I think what we're saying is we've been doing this for 20 plus years, and we've been doing it successfully. And some of our members have gone on to do like amazing stuff. And sure, that's anecdotal, but it seems to have worked for us. And it seems to be a successful way to do it where everyone sort of walks away having gotten something from it.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to do an author statement and not read it till after you've read the story, then that might be different.
Yeah.
But I think it's almost poisoning the well to have the author's intent stated up front, and that kind of influences how you're reading the story, I think. But
yeah, I just thought I would bring that up because I was just thinking of our own methodology, and I was recently it was a SIFWA auction, and I auctioned off a critique, and I emailed the author beforehand. I said, you know, I know some of the workshops are doing this statement. You know, if you want to do that, and they agreed with me. They were like, no, I will tell you after you read it what I was trying to do. I'm like, okay, good, yeah, because this is how editors are going to approach the story. But you know, look, everyone has their own methodology. That may not work for your particular group, but I think it works for us doing the statement after everyone's read it.
I think so too. Do you remember that time, Matt, that we had somebody auditioning for the group, and the person was actually heckling during the during the critique? I wouldn't say. I mean, the person wasn't shouting out loud or anything, but under their breath, they were saying yeah, right.
Yeah,
or,
this,
yeah, like somebody was saying, oh, like the story takes too long to get started. Yeah, right. Yeah, sure. Anyway, yeah, the writer should stay quiet during the critiques.
We've had some interesting characters come through Altered Fluid. We interviewed a person who was a homeless violinist. Do you remember this?
I do, and she was really actually an excellent critiquer.
She was, and a great writer. And she said the group was too much work for her, if I recall.
That's right. That's correct. I mean, we were meeting almost on a weekly basis, which I have no idea how the heck we did that.
And 3 stories at a time.
Yeah.
Which you know, 30 minutes each. It was like 2 hours of critiques. And then we were meeting in person, and we were doing this weekly. It was just, and then some of the stories would be like 20,000 words long. I don't know how we were doing it.
I don't know either. Wow. What about rewrites?
Yeah.
What's your feeling on rewrites? I mean, my own take is that it's the law of the diminishing returns. If you know, for the same blind spots that you have as an author, you spread it out like a disease to your writers group. If you come back, let's say the next week, you provide a revised version of the story that was critiqued the week before. The writers, then they kind of, sometimes in their minds, they're thinking of the previous version, and it influences the way they're reading the current story. So I'm a person who does submit rewrites to the group, but I always keep it about 6 months apart between rewrites so that people can come in with a fresh eye.
Yeah, I think that's important, because I think that you can sometimes get too close to something, both as an author and as a reader, that if you submit a story and then I read it and then you submit it again, a month later, I might be getting something from the story that isn't in this version because I know what you were intending from the last version. So if enough time has passed, I might forget the details, and then I can read it fresh. I remember, I think you were in the group at the time, there was someone who would write these great stories, but they would have like a couple little things that needed tweaking. And we'd be like, yeah, just tweak this. And they would come back with a complete rewrite, like word for word, everything was different. And then it would have new flaws. And then you'd be like, oh, what happened to that version you had? That was good. Why did you get rid of that? And then they would completely rewrite it again.
I do remember that person. Yeah, that was. And by the way, when we got started, Matt, I don't know if you remember, none of us had been. I mean, I'm trying to think if anybody had been published. There might have been 1 or 2 of us that had minor publications, and over a period of time, you just saw just an eruption of success stories of people just breaking into all the mags and then book deals, and some members, going on to win major awards.
Yeah.
We've come a long way, I have to say.
We really have, and you know, one of the things I think we wanted to talk about was the potential downsides of a writers group.
We've by the way, we're talking about downsides or the potential problems with writers groups. One of them is conformity in your writing.
Yeah.
You always want to maintain your voice. And one of the dangers of writers groups, I would say, is that, you don't want every writer producing stories with the same voice. And that can sometimes happen when everybody's listening to the same advice. You want to make sure you maintain your unique qualities. And the way that we address that, I think, is through having writers that focus on different subgenres.
Mm-hmm.
We have our horror writers, our sci-fi writers, fantasy writers. We've had young adult writers, space opera writers. All of those different subgenres add a spice, and then diversity of gender and backgrounds. Also, all of that kind of spices up the meetings and prevents conformity in the voice of the stories. But that's a potential danger.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we're a pretty diverse group. We've had like we said, lots of different members from all over the place, and I think that it always provides a fresh perspective. Like you said, some of our members are more horror oriented, some are more science fiction, some do fantasy, and I think that's great. I love that part of it. But yeah, I think there is a danger, especially when we're all echoing each other. There's like this. I think that after a while, we can sort of anticipate what everyone's going to like and what everyone's going to dislike, and you might try to write for that particular audience, and you might not challenge yourself enough. You might say, well, that worked last time, so I'm going to do it again. I was listening to the Alan Moore BBC Maestro thing, which I by the way, if you haven't watched that, it's great. And one of the things that Alan Moore talks about is like anytime he does something, like maybe he'll do some kind of trick or storyline or attempt to do something, he makes a point of never doing that again, and he wants to continually challenge himself so he'll grow as an artist. And I think that's important too, is to always do that. And I think that as in a writers group, the danger I think might be to in that conformity, and it is a time commitment. I think that especially early on when we were critiquing 3 stories a week, meeting every week, some of those stories were 25, 30,000 words. Yeah. And I think I was in 2 writers groups at the time.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it was crazy. I was in, Altered Fluid and then this one in Hoboken, I think we called it Borderlands. And then that one also had like multiple stories a week. So I was reading, 5, 6 stories a week, and, huge time commitment. Somehow I managed to do it. But I could see, someone being like, that's too much. Like, I don't have time for that. And this was like pre social media too. Like now everybody's distracted, people watch TV while they're scrolling on their phones. Like it's a lot harder to commit to things today, I think, than before. And I mean, and then the other thing too is, we spoke about it a little bit, but there can be drama, right, in a writers group.
There can be. We've been pretty good about it. I mean, we've settled into a nice chemistry where we avoid that. But I do remember early on in the group's history that there would be sometimes online disputes, and I always try to just shut those down right away and say, let's talk about it in person. Because that always, whenever we talk about things in person, things get quickly resolved, as opposed to back and forth emails. So that's one thing. But I think another way is just we vet our members very carefully to make sure that the personalities all will fit nicely within the group and avoid. We want a minimal amount of drama for sure.
It's been pretty good, and I think we're lucky. I was talking about the Hoboken group. There was just oh man, there was this one guy who was just very haughty, and he was I don't know how he ended up in the group. He was extremely like bigoted. He took me aside one day and he's like, "Don't you think you're better than all these people?" And talking
Oh,
about
geez.
minorities. I'm like, "Oh my God, no! Like who are you? Get away from me!" Like I was like, and he left the group thankfully, but he was just such a jerk. And one day this woman who was in the group was supposed to come to the meeting, and she didn't show. We were like, "Oh God, she said she was coming. I wonder what happened." We were all concerned. He's like, "Be adults. She's an adult. What are you worried about?" And just very dismissive of our feelings. And it turned out that she was diabetic and her blood sugar dropped and she like passed out in the tub and almost drowned. So like
Oh my gosh.
our worries were founded, right? So it was just there was just a lot of drama in there. And
Hmm.
one guy, I might have told you this story, told me that he's like, "Yeah, I've had some stories in years past." I go, "Which ones?" He's like, "Oh, I said, "Oh, Ellen Datlow's years past." "Yeah, that one." Okay. And like an idiot, I believed him. He was totally lying to me. Made it all up because I had Googled him and his name was like nowhere to be found. He's like, "Oh, I wrote under a pseudonym." I'm like, "Sure you did. Sure you did."
Wow.
Um, and yeah,
He perfected his fiction, obviously. I
yeah,
mean.
he was a good storyteller. He also had a Ninja, those super fast bikes. And I made the mistake one time after the meeting of getting on the back of the bike with him as he rode around the neighborhood. That was frightening. Those motorcycles are fast. And then we had this one guy. I won't say his name because I think he's still writing. But we used to meet at a coffee shop in Hoboken, and then after the meeting, we would go over to a bar. And then this guy's like, "Why don't we just meet in the bar?" Just like skip the coffee shop altogether because he liked his cups, and he was like, he would always say, "I make more money than all of you combined." And he would always just buy the whole night. He would just buy, like, we didn't spend a dime when he came out. And but he's like, I can't publish my books in the United States because I owe them taxes. So I published my books in Canada or something. I mean, we just had a bunch of characters in there come through. I'm trying to
That's
think of Altered Fluid if we've had any crazy people
uh
come.
boy, I'm trying to think myself. Um, we've had some harsh critiquers that have
Yeah.
kind of come and gone early on in the group. Um, and we've auditioned some interesting people. We did have the homeless violinist. Uh, yeah, I almost don't want to get into the others because they're still writing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's been an interesting ride, I gotta say.
It's been an interesting ride. Yeah, we've also had a lot of guests come through Altered Fluid um, that have
Yeah,
come
all
just to critique, guest critiquers.
yeah, we've had Trevor Quattry, Ellen Datlow, Sheila Williams, um,
Kelly Link,
Kelly Link, and Gavin
Gavin
Grant.
Grant. Yeah.
Um, who am I forgetting? I mean,
There's
we've had
there's
a
tons.
bunch.
There's so many. You could just keep going. I'm
Yeah,
I'm
it's been a
probably
while since we've
blanking.
had a guest. By the way, we should get a guest.
Yeah.
Um,
We
but
we
it's always
yeah.
fun to get to when an outside editor comes in and it just spices up the meeting. And I know that I actually sold a story that was critiqued in the group in a session where Sheila Williams attended,
Mm-hmm.
and Sheila gave me some really good notes about the end of the story and why it didn't
Yeah.
work for her,
Yeah.
and it allowed me to really fix the story up and ultimately get it published in Asimov's.
Yeah.
So that's a good story.
And we've also had some let's just say difficult guests. There was that
Right,
you
right.
know who I'm talking about. Let's call this person Zelda. I've written about them on my blog, and I have Dispatches from the Outer Deep, where is my blog, and also a little nonfiction book I just released,
Mhm.
where I talk about this person Zelda who came in as a guest critiquer and told me said that she loathed my story, like like stronger than hate. and apparently I took this in stride. Like I just like, okay. But like inwardly,
you took it like a you took it like a champ, Matt. I mean, you were just nodding and smiling.
I mean, inside I was just mortified, and I was like, oh my God. And this story was about like a stage, like people acting, and Zelda was like, do you hate actors? Do you hate these people? Like it was like I was just taken aback by it. And it turns out though that, with very few edits, I sold that story to a good market, and it got like it was really well received. Like which just goes to show like there's no accounting for taste, right? So somebody who loathes a story, like other people really like it. So I mean, the story, I guess it challenged her in some way. I'm not sure why.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I found my personal experience is that if a story evokes a strong reaction
Yeah.
from the reader, if the reader is kind of neutral and kind of not too excited,
Yeah.
that's a bad sign. If the reader is upset and angry, or
Yeah.
is really complimenting it, off saying it's the best story I've ever read, or somebody says it's the worst story I've ever read, there's something there that's working in the story. So I think that's a good sign when you get that kind of those radical reactions.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Mhm.
I was also, it just reminded me of another workshop I was in. I'm not going to name it because listeners have probably heard of it, maybe have even attended it, where I thought some of the critiquers were fantastic. And these were writers at the top of their game. So there was a little bit of an intimidation factor. And I thought some of the critiques were like, wow, like this is why you are a successful writer. Like you are giving fantastic critiques. And there were other people, it was like ad hominem, like, how dare you write this, and I always just find that can be, that I always feel like that is, first of all, it's cheap because I think it's like, it's like you're attacking the person, not the story, but also it feels almost like somehow the story is threatening their ego on some level. And so that they, in order to, like, it's a very narcissistic response, right? So if the ego is threatened, they have to attack the person that's threatening their ego. So it's like there's almost like something about the story that their ego self cannot abide, and they must attack you because in order to make themselves feel better. So the difficult thing in those situations, I think, is to recognize that those types of critiques are not about you personally, even though it feels like it is, right? They're attacking you and not the story. But it's more about the internal psychology of the person giving that message to you. And it's very difficult in the moment to separate the two, but I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, because I think, if you do this long enough, eventually you're going to get someone who's like, how dare you write this awful thing, you scoundrel.
No, absolutely. And then it's important. And, I'm sure knowing you didn't react. You take it and you just move on, because there's no dividends from reacting and confronting the person. So you take it as just one critique of many. Take what you can, and that's probably a good way to end our session on writers groups. I think the ultimate point is that as the writer, you're the final arbiter of all this. You may have 10 different opinions, all of this advice, and I view it as it's all input that I can sift through and decide this is really what I want to do for my story, or this is not. So you're the final arbiter. So you can just reject that critique where they're saying, how dare you? I'll move on to the next critique.
Find what resonates with you, what's going to make the story better. What you feel works on an emotional level. Like I've gotten comments from people. I'm like, that's a great idea. that's not the story I want to tell, you know. So that it's important to sort of trust your own instincts and trust your own intuition when you get a critique. But yeah, we're
Hey
coming
Matt,
up. Yeah, go ahead.
before you finish up, I thought I'd say, how do we, if we were to form a new writers group today, how do we
Yeah.
do that?
Yeah, that's a
I mean,
good
we were
question.
lucky. We did it through the writing class. That could still be a potential way to do it. Take writing classes and then stick with those members who you have a chemistry with of the class, I suppose.
So that is a really good question, and I wish I had better answers now, because at the time, you know, I got referred to the writers group through a class. I think the same for you, and then the Hoboken one. Devin and I founded that in Hoboken. I just put flyers up around town, writers group, you know, and then I think Hoboken had a forum specifically, like a online forum specifically for Hoboken, and I put ads up in there every week. It was like a free ad, and then people would just show up, and some people never came back, but some people did. I would there's online stuff. I think there's, what is it, critters.org, and then there's a few others that
you know where else, at writing, if you go to writing conventions like ReaderCon or World Fantasy Con, you can ask around, talk to other writers that are from your hometown, and see if they're interested in forming a group. Again, it's a bit touch and go because you want to make sure you have the right chemistry, but that's a way to get started, at least by asking around.
And there's also, like, I know a lot of the magazines now have Discord channels. So I believe Clark's World has. I'm not sure if Lightspeed has, but like, there's probably like social media channels that you could go to and then just pop on and say, hey, you know, I'm a writer living in such and such a town. Anyone interested in forming a writers group? And you know, I know on my blog someone said, oh, I'm in a small town. I don't have anyone nearby. And I'm like, well, you know, online writers groups are a thing. I mean, that's what we do now. Like, we all live in the New York City area, but we do it virtually. And we've had, you know, some of our members, you know, don't even live in the United States and show up from time to time. So, you know, that's a way to do it too, is to start it that way. Yeah, I mean, I think just like reaching out to other writers and being like, well, where do you know, do you have a writers group that is looking for new members, or do you know of a writers group looking for new members? It's really just a matter of, like you said earlier, finding your people and you know, communicating with them of what you're looking to do. And I think also, you know, when you're founding a writers group, I think it, like, specifically expressing what you want the group to be about and what you want it to do. Because I think that also is an issue. Like, if people have very different ideas of what they want from the group, you know, you may butt heads a little bit down the line. So I think just being very explicit up front.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Well, look, I'm so happy that I found my people and that I've been with them for so long. And still, you know, my most important tool for my writing is the writers group, promising a story to the group, forcing myself to write. I know you're in a different category than I am, Matt. You're very prolific and you get your writing in every day, but I use the group to motivate me to just get things done. I'm very deadline driven. Yeah. So the group helps me in that respect, which reminds me, I promised a story to the group this week. I don't think it's happening.
Well, maybe that could be a topic for a next or future podcast, is like, you know, deadlines versus schedules, pantsing versus plotting, you know, all that stuff. I mean, you know, we're in the nerd verse, right? So we're in the topics are virtually limitless. So, yeah, but we should probably wrap it up because we're coming up on an hour. But Dave, if folks wanted to find more of your stuff, where could they go?
Well, I'm on Facebook. I'm David Mercurio Rivera, and on Twitter, Mercurio Rivera, and also on my website, mercuriorivera.com. How about you?
Okay. Yeah, so my website is matthewkressel.net. I'm on Blue Sky. I don't use Twitter as much these days. I'm on Facebook. And then I have my blog is... well, just go to matthewkressel.net on the front page. You'll see, because I have two different blogs. One is just writing news and one is writing advice. So you could check those out there. But
okay, well, it's been a fun inaugurating episode.
It has been. Yeah, I think we have a lot to talk about. I can sense that there is so much more that we could say. This hour went really fast, so I hope all you listeners out there, all three of you,
Mom, I hope you really got some advice out of this.
Yeah. I hope that you'll come back for future episodes where we're gonna have guests down the line and interesting topics. But yeah, so this has been great. So I'm Matt Kressel,
and I'm David Mercurio Rivera,
and this has been Nerd Count.
Nerdcast.
All right.
Count. I misstated the name of our own podcast.
Well,
anyway.
We'll get better. It's his first episode. So, all right. See you in the next episode. All right. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye. You have been listening to the Nerd Count podcast. That's our show. But if you want more shows, check us out at nerdcountpodcast.com or your favorite podcasting site. See you next time.
Get those nerds!